Hello. In this video I want to explain the approach that I adopt in debriefing a DISC report. Now this approach was developed by TTI Success Insights in Australia, and I have found it to be the most effective and structured approach for success. So without any further ado, let's jump right in and talk about it. There are 4 steps in this process. The first is preparation. The second is building rapport. The third is building the model. And the fourth is providing feedback. In preparation, there's a process called the success discovery process. And this process adopts a model called Big Little Big to look at a report in detail and come up with questions and insights, if you wish, to allow you to be ready for the debrief. Here you will see the notes, the actual pages from the Success Discovery Insights workbook. So it's all there, it's all available to you in the Dropbox in DISC debriefing guides. And you see here that in the workbook there are actual pages where you end up with your notes, if you wish, where you've prepared, gone through the exercise, the Big Little Big exercise. You actually have your notes there ready, so that when you actually go into a debriefing with the client, you have everything prepared. So I strongly recommend that you actually look at this document and go through it and use this document. Now, I'm going to go through the Big Little Big very quickly, and I'm going to go through a little bit of detail. The Big Little Big process is very, very simple. We take a big look at the report, a little look, i.e. we go into detail, and then a big look again. So the first big look is we ask simple questions. What's high and low? What scores are high, what are low? What, if any, patterns do we see? And what, if anything, changes from the natural to the adapted style? So we get a sense of what this profile looks like. Then, for each behaviour D, I, S and C, we ask some detailed questions. We go into what we call the little look. So how would you describe each score? What descriptors would you use? How would you describe it? How might the other 3 factors influence or impact it? So each one of them, how might they be impacted by the other 3 factors? And what can you ask to understand the movements between them? So in terms of P and C words, R words and descriptors, what can you use to actually help you understand what's actually happening in terms of movements? What questions can you ask of yourself? Number 1, to try and get a sense of it. But number 2, particularly when you're talking to the client, what questions can you ask the client to help you better understand? And then having done that, you go through the exercise of saying, okay, now what big things jump out of me again? Is there anything new or anything extra or any other insights that I've had based on what I've just done? So let's look at the Big Little Big in a little bit more detail. First big, what jumps out at you? So what's high or low? And remember that it's the distance from the energy line that matters. So quite often something that is low may in fact be the predominant behavioural factor. And a lot of people miss this. They focus on what's above the line, what's above the energy line, and they're actually missing out on something really, really important. So what's high or low? Number 1. Number 2, having looked at that, what is the pattern? What patterns can we see? So for example, is it a 1, 2 or 3 factor pattern? And if so, what are the common elements? An example here would be if D and I are above the line, we can say, well, that's a 2-factor pattern. And what can we say about it? Well, we can say that they're both outgoing, tell, talk. Or if D and C were above the line, that would be a 2-factor pattern. And what would be common would be the results focus. Or if C and S were above the line, that would be a 2-factor pattern. And it would be about reserved, ask, listen, and so on. So we look for patterns in the report, and what will strengthen, what supports, what strengthens a factor, and what softens or weakens a factor, if you wish. Then we look at what, if anything, changes. So do we see adaptation? For example, anything above 10 points is certainly worth looking at. So if there's a movement of 10 points or more in the adaptation, what does that look like? How would we describe that movement? We describe it as a large movement or a small movement, and something that crosses the energy line particularly, that will have a huge impact because there's quite a different change of style in that particular area of problems and challenges or people and contexts or so on. So we look at that in great detail. The idea behind this first big look, and it's here in the notes, is for you to have a list of questions, comments or insights, to come up with these questions, comments or insights and get your sense of it. Then we look into the little, into the great detail. Now in little, we try to describe each score. So the first thing is we look at the D, I, S, Z, each one individually, and say, can we describe it? So for example, we might say that above 70 we'll call it a high score. Below 30 we'll call it a low score. Between 50 and 70 we might call it relatively high, and between 30 and 50 relatively low. So again, I'm not a big fan of the high and low language terminology at all, to be really honest. I tend to work off the continuum page, but this is it's a methodology, and if you like using the vertical graphs, sometimes this works. Then we look and say, what descriptors would you use? So we go to the descriptor page and we say, what keywords would you use to describe this? So in the case of the C above the line, the diplomatic, right up to, are they almost pedantic and so precise it's too precise. So what descriptors would you use for that score, depending where it is, how high or low it is? You can go to, by the way, page 138 in the Universal Language Disc Manual, and that explains this very clearly and gives you a very good indication of descriptors you should use. So for example, above 70 you should use all the high descriptors, below 30 you should use all the low descriptors, and between 30 and 70 you describe what descriptors you think you should use as appropriate. But it's all from page 138 onward. The Universal Language Disc is well worth having a read. Then you ask the question again, looking at the little look, looking in detail, how might the three factors affect the one factor? So we're looking at D, how might the other three affect it? Looking at I, how might the other three affect it? And so on. So you try and understand how they actually affect it. Do they strengthen it or do they soften it? And interestingly here, when we're looking at this, it's not just looking for a pattern of they're the same. So for example, the D above the line, or the D on the right on the continuum, a direct D, they're forceful, outgoing and engaged, results focused and so on. But you can see how a low C, or on the continuum and C on the left hand side, sort of fits in with this. Then we look at the adaptations and we ask, what might cause the adaptations to take place? So we're preparing questions to ask around this, and this is really important. So you'll see there on the right hand side of that slide the formula, appendix 1, formula for creating questions. This is really important. So for example, for a factor moving up, so let's say the I is moving up or the S is moving up in the adaptation. The questions we would ask are, is there anything causing you to take on more? And you use a P and C word or an R word or a descriptor. Is there anything that's causing you to do more? And again, you'd use a P and C word, an R word descriptor. To focus more on, to pay more attention to. So these are the words you use for a factor going up when something's increasing. For a factor going down, you say the exact opposite. So for example, is there anything causing you to hold back from, pull back from, focus less on, pay less attention to? And again, you use the P and C words, the R words and the descriptors to fill in those gaps. And for the factors where there's no real movement, I just broadly ignore them. So that's your little, if you wish. So now you've done your preparation, you've done your big, little, and you want to do the last big look. You say, having done that little now, is there anything else that jumps out at me, any other insights I have that you think are important? And that sort of wraps up the preparation. And that now takes us to step 2 in the process. And step 2 is building rapport. And there's 2 or 3 things here I think that are really important. So you've got your preparation ready, you've got the report there, and I'll tell about how I actually use the report in a moment in the debriefing. You've all that sort of sitting there, and the client comes in, you're having the meeting, you want to build rapport. What do you do? Well, the first thing that I typically do is I ask the client to explain to me the objective of the meeting. Why are they there? What are they hoping to get out of this meeting? Just that question alone can elicit a very, very interesting response. A lot of things that you weren't aware of can come out and be on the table that you can actually combine when you actually go through the debrief, and you can add these into the debrief. So it's a really important question to tease out gently with the client, like, why are we here? What are we hoping to accomplish? And the second thing that I do is I try to explain to the client that this is about getting more information. It's about understanding, collecting more information that will give us more insights into themselves, so they can become more effective. And I always talk about building on strengths. I always talk about superior performance. So how can you build on your strengths? How can you become a really superior performer? Let's get all the information the psychometric has to give us and use in the most effective way. The third area I talk about is that what we're measuring here is how. Now, this is really, really important to explain to the client. We're not measuring whether you're good or bad or anything. There are no good, bad, no right or wrong. We're just measuring how you go about doing something. How are you about dealing with problems and challenges, people, context, and so on and so forth. How. And I also explain that this is universal. It's gender neutral, race neutral, and so on and so forth. This is a universal language. There's no judgment in this language, good, bad, or indifferent. So having done all of that and built that rapport and positioned this with the client, I then move on to the third step. And the third step is building the model. Now, as you know, I've done a video previously on how to build the model, and I strongly encourage you to go back and look at that exercise. You can see here on the slide the notes I put in there, building the model. But let's just have a quick conversation about it, just to make sure that we've covered the base well. The first thing I do when I build a model is I draw the XY axis. And I say to the client, have you ever noticed how? Some people are more focused on results. I put on the top of the axis, and on the bottom I put on the vertical axis, I say other people are more focused on relationships and people. Have you ever noticed that? And I explain how that's a continuum. You can be anywhere you want along that continuum between results and people in terms of where you naturally focus. And I also explain to them it doesn't mean that somebody who is results focused can't focus on people. Of course they can, but their natural style is to focus more on results and dish out people focus and so on. Then I draw the horizontal axis. I say, have you ever noticed how some people are outgoing, tell, talk, and some people are more reserved, more ask and listen type of people? And they say, yeah, and I explain again how it's continuous, it can be anywhere on it. Having done that, I say that we now have 4 quadrants with people who are results, task, goal, focus, and are outgoing, tell, talk. And we call that particular style dominance, that behavioural style. The behavioural style that is outgoing, tell, talk, and is people, relationship, focus, we call that a particular style influencing. And the style that is people, relationship, focus, and more ask, listen, reserved, we call that particular style steadiness. And the style that is ask, listen, reserved, and more task, goal, focus, we call that style compliant. D-I-S-N-C, dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. So there we have our model built. Having done that, we then take the next step and we look at each one of them in turn. So we then draw on our, remember this is a sheet of paper, we have a pencil and paper, remember pencil selling. So we're building the model with the client so they understand. We then say, let's talk about D, and we start with D. And we say, D is all about dealing with problems and challenges, how one deals with problems and challenges. And we explain that to them. And they say, yeah, okay, I get that. That's a particular style. How do we deal with problems and challenges? That's what we're measuring here. We're not measuring any good at dealing with problems and challenges. We're measuring how do you deal with problems and challenges. And we say the person who has this direct style, who leans into problems and challenges, results focus, who's outgoing, tell, talk. We say that this particular person has certain focuses, wants, things they're looking for, certain emotions and certain fears. And we describe them. So we say in the case of the D, we say that the want is results. The focus is results. That's what they want. We say that the emotion is anger, a short fuse. And we elaborate on that. We explain how it's a short fuse, but once it's over, and they just get on with things. And the fear is the fear of being taken advantage of. And then we go and do the same for the I. So it's people and contacts. The R word is recognition. The emotion is enthusiasm. And the fear, of course, is the fear of rejection, the fear of ridicule. And then we move over to the S. And we talk about how the S is pace and consistency. How the want is relationship and respect, how the fear is instability, and how the emotion is poker face. And then we move up to C, compliance, procedures and constraints. And we talk about how the want is to be right, the R word is to be right. How the emotion is fear, and how the fear is a fear of making a mistake. So we build that model and we explain it to them and they understand it and they can see it. When we've done that, we then move and we build the continuum. And in the continuum, we just simply draw a line down the middle of the page and 4 lines across. And we say for each of the P's and C's, so D, I, S and C, problems and challenges, people and contacts, pace and consistency and procedures and constraints. We write those on each of the line. Okay, there's 2 different approaches. We've already talked about the right hand side. We talked about the direct D. We talked about the outgoing I. We talked about the steady S, and we talked about the precise, compliant C. But we explained how there's an other end to the continuum, an other end, an opposite if you wish. So for example, in the case of D, we have somebody who is reflective as opposed to being direct. They're not leaning into problems and challenges. They're reflecting. They're asking the question, is this even my problem and challenge to address? In the case of the outgoing I, we have the opposite, which is the reserved I, more skeptical, more fact-based, more data-based. Prove it to me, show it to me. They're not enthusiastic. They have a different style of dealing with influencing people, with people in contact and how they engage with people in contacts. In the case of the S, we have the steady S on the right hand side. We say, well, the other side, we have somebody who's dynamic. They embrace change, they love change. They're not scared by change, they're not scared by a loss of stability. And then in the case of the C, we have procedures and constraints, we have the precise on the right hand side, but on the left hand side we have the pioneering, the exact opposite. They bend the rules, they're not afraid of taking risks of getting it right and wrong. So we build that continuum, we explain that continuum to them. Now, once we've that done, we then move out of the building the model stage and we move into the actual debrief proper. So now you're well prepared and the client is well prepared. You did your preparation in advance, you did your big little big, you used the discovery process to come up with your questions and your insights. You then position this with the client carefully. So you ask them the important questions to prepare them for this, how to understand why they were there and so on. Then you built the model for them, the XY axis, the 4 quadrants, gave them all the key words so they understood it, and then you show them how this is on a continuum. So now everybody's ready for the next step, which is actually to look at the individual's report proper. And when I do this, I don't actually open the report. I typically have 2 pages I work off. I work off the continuum page and the descriptor page. And I leave everything else aside. I will sometimes also have the vertical graphs. I may have the 12 behavioural factors showing how they compare to the norms, and I may have the wheel, particularly if I'm working in a team environment where I want to show them how they fit into the team in terms of the team wheel. But typically I'm working off 2 sheets, the descriptor page and the continuum. That's all I have in front of me and in front of the client. Now there are 2 ways you can approach the actual debriefing. You can do it by factor or you can do it by graph. By factor, what we do very simply is we have our introduction, we set everything up, we explain the page, and then we actually look at D, the natural and the adapted style, I, the natural adapted, S, the natural adapted, C, the natural adapted, and then we move to the action steps. The second way is we do it by graph, and this is my preferred way, it's the way I do it. So we do our introduction with our setup, we explain the page, we build the graphs, we do all of that, and then we actually go and we look at the natural style, D, I, S and C, and we've completed the exercise on that. We look at the adapted style, D, I, S and C, and the movements there, and then we move to action steps. For me personally, I find doing it by a graph to be a better way than doing it by factor. So now we move into the debrief proper. I usually start interesting enough with the descriptor page. And what I do with the descriptor page is I start at the energy line. Depending on which side they're on, I either work my way up or work my way down through the words. And I call out the words, each word. And I say, does that resonate with you? And they say, yes, yes, yes. And I may well pass by the highlighted area on the descriptor page and keep going until they say, no, that doesn't resonate, and draw a line. And then I may go in the opposite direction across the energy line and call out the words until they say stop. And I would draw that as a box on the descriptor, on that particular D, I, S and C. Draw as a box and say, that's the area within which you operate and you feel comfortable. You are specifically this highlighted area, but you're able to flex quite easily up and down a little bit, and that's the area you operate in. So now as we're talking about, they're already accepting and these descriptors. They say, yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me. And then often I will ask them questions. I'll say, okay, give me an example of when you were this or that or the other. And I'll use a descriptor and get them to sort of write their own report. So now they're talking about it and say, and what happened when you were this and what happened when you were that? And have you had good or bad experiences when you're like this or you're like that? So I'm teasing out questions. I'm engaging them in a conversation around the descriptors. And I do that for D, I, S and C. When I've done that, I then move to the continuum page. And I say, now let's look at your particular graph. And again, they're familiar with D, I, S and C. They're familiar with the P and C words, the R words, the emotions, the fears. They're familiar with all of that. I say, here's where you are on the graphs. And we talk about and we describe it. I talk about patterns. I talk about the combinations, how things support each other, and how the D is above the line, the S is below the line, and how that combination might work. How the D is above the line, the C is below the line, and how that combination might work, and the risks involved in that. Of this direct style, who's leaning into problems and challenges, doesn't pay too much attention, charges into things, and they're pioneering, so they're not crossing the T's and not dotting the I's as well. So I talk about these various combinations, the good, the bad, and how they support each other, how they weaken each other, and so on and so forth. So I go through that exercise with them and I have that discussion with them. And when we've completed that discussion in its entirety, only then do I say, now, you're adapting. And I go through the adaptation, say, your G is moving down a little bit, and I go through and say, why might that be? And again, remember we've the questions already prepared. What's causing you to, in the case going up, focus more on, pay more attention to, and so on. And the case going down, step back from, or pay less attention to, or focus less on. We have these questions ready. We've already prepared them, and we ask these questions, and we elicit a response from the client. And we go through this step by step. When we've all of that done, only then will I move over to the actual report proper. And when I move over to the report proper, typically what I do is I go through the report, I just explain the sections to them. I don't try to do anything in the report itself. I explain the various sections to them so they're comfortable, they know what the sections are, and then I show them this debriefing guide. So for example, we look at the general characteristics page, and I explain to them how this debriefing guide, I want them to go away over the following week and do these exercises. So in the case of general characteristics, it says, list 3 statements that describe your communicating style that you would like others to know about you. So they list the 3 of them, and it says, putting your behaviours into action. So how are you using these traits on a daily basis? Are you using these traits more in your personal or professional role? And when you've done that, when I've done that, I explain that page to them. I then show them the checklist for communicating, the don'ts for communication, the communication tips, the ideal environment, the perceptions, the adaptive style, the descriptors, the style, keys to motivating, areas for improvement, and keys to managing. So these are all the sections in this debriefing guide. And I ask the client to go away over the following week to read the report. I'll give them my notes, by the way, so they'll get a copy of those notes that we've done, the models that we've built, all of that. They get a copy of that, they take that with them. I usually hand that over to them. They go away with that. And we'll have scribbled, remember, lots of action items and comments and thoughts on those sheets as we were working through the exercise together. They'll go away with that, they'll read the report, and they'll complete this debriefing guide themselves. And then they'll come back to me a week later or 2 weeks later, we'll sit down together, we'll go through this, and we'll pick particular areas that we think we need to focus on, that we need to pay attention to build on strengths and to mitigate weaknesses. And we'll turn these into action items, specific things that they have to go and do. In the context of where you're comparing somebody to a job and you've done a development plan for somebody, you can actually take some of these items and populate the development plan with them if you're familiar with that model. So that's broadly the approach that I take to debriefing a DISC behaviours report. As you know, there's a video on the playlist there of how to debrief a driving force report. I encourage you to look at that as well. I encourage you to look at the other videos on how to build the various models, so that you have that in your head and that you're clear about that when you go in to meet with a client. Finally, in the Talent Insights report and the Trimetrics DNA report, there is a section where the behaviours and driving force are combined, and we talk about that integrated section, how they support each other and how they conflict and so on, how they work together and don't work together. And I tend to do that when I've done the debriefing of both sections. I tend then to look at that, and usually that's pretty simple and straightforward. It's a very short exercise because the client at this stage is very familiar with the models and has a deep understanding of their own particular styles, both behaviours and in their driving forces or motivators. So that's the approach I adopt. I hope you found this useful, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.